get the pleasure of speaking after Dave Thomas and Ryan Davis. So I figured since this is my first talk at a conference, I could at least mimic the bare minimum of what they did and go shoeless as well and show off my blue socks. So I started working in Ruby about 1.5 years ago, a little bit more than that. And I've loved programming ever since I got started. And one thing I always loved doing is just slowly going deeper and deeper and deeper through the stack of technologies that I work with. So after starting with Ruby and Rails, eventually I worked through how Rails works, digging into the different features of active record and controllers and all that. And eventually you get down to the very bottom and there's Rack. So here is an explanation of what Rack does and how we can use it in our web apps. A little bit more about me. I'm a senior developer at Notch 8. We're a web development consultancy in San Diego. We do mostly Rails apps and a lot of DevOps work. So what is Rack? So at its simplest, it is the interface from your Ruby app to the web server. It abstracts it so that it is a thing you don't have to worry about, and it just works. There's some of you that may have never had to interact with it directly ever and gotten your jobs done just fine. So why do we have it? So again, like I said, I like to dig through the history of some of these things I worked through and why we even have this thing called Rack and why it's not done a different way. So what I discovered is we started with CGI sometime around right when the www was getting popular. And it was a handy way where you could tell a web server, here's a directory of scripts. Please run them if this path is called to these scripts. And the web server would say, OK. And it would bundle up the requests to a whole bunch of data and environment variables and run your script with those environment variables present. It worked, but it had several performance problems and people wanted more integration with the web server. So we moved on to web server modules. These are things like mod Python and mod Perl and mod PHP, where you stick the language in with the server. So it'd run with, say, Apache. These enabled much more performance because the app was able to stay running and not be a process that was started and stopped with every request. And you had full access to everything the web server could do. But it did couple your app to that web server, and they got to be rather complicated. So we have moved on to these things that are more like app servers, where it is individual for your language and your app. And starting with, I think WSGI was the first one for Python, it was developed where there would be a standard way for this language and web applications in this language to interact with a web server. And so in Ruby, the one that developed was called Rack. Rack Basics. It still hasn't evolved all that much from what CGI was. We really just have a function that is called with variables from the request. So the simplest Ruby web app is just a proc that receives the environment as the first argument and the only argument and returns an array. And that array has a specific interface that is a status code, a hash of headers, and a body. And the body has to be something that responds to each, which is why you see me wrapping the string in an array here. That is it. That is the simplest Ruby web app. My brand new framework here doesn't do all that much. So just to simplify and explain what's going on here, and to add in one more term that explains just about everything Rack does, is when you receive the request, it goes through things called middleware, which enable you to manipulate the request on the way into your app. You can change parameters, add parameters based on what you see in the environment, do everything you need to there, pass it on to your app. Your app does what it needs to do, interact with the database, and then responds, and your middleware is able to manipulate the response as well. So here's my handy-dandy example of a simple rack app where I can add stuff to the path. And yes, this is the longest part of putting this talk together, was making this look exactly like Safari. So I could do this interactively. So we can refresh this, and it's just getting the path info and returning it. Here's the code, just to give an example. To run a rack app, there are a few methods involved for the configuration. One is run, which simply says, this thing that follows is the application. So it is something that responds to call, like the Lambda here. It takes the environment, and I'm returning hello world with the path. Nice and simple. But one little tip since I started using Ruby 2.3, this little tilde here means that Ruby will finally stop adding any indentation you like to do here to your here doc. So if you're like me and you obsessively indent your code nicely, this means you don't have to slam this all the way to the edge so that your strings don't have extra white space. Handy tip. Okay, now on to middleware. This is the biggest part of Rack, because your app is one thing and you'll design that and it'll be whatever it happens to be, and it's awesome. But middleware is where we can do interesting things, and it's where, even when we're using Sinatra or Rails or whatever web framework we're doing to make our work simpler, we're still able to manipulate the request and do special things that we need that are unique to our application. The simplest definition of middleware is for doing something before a request is handled by the application or after it's handled by the application. So examples are authenticating requests, parsing body content, setting headers, and manipulating the response. So an example of code was, I figured, the best way to display what the interface for middleware is for those unfamiliar with it. Middleware is simply a class. It must accept the application as the first argument to the initialized method. And you will store that because that's what's required to keep the whole flow going. And then you can also store any configuration you want after that. Then it also responds to call, because the interface for everything in Rack is simply the same as a proc, something that responds to call. So then call accepts the environment, just like a Rack application does. And then before you make a call to app.call, you can do whatever you want and add stuff to the environment. And then that will continue to be passed along and be available to middleware that is called after this or to your application. Once you call app.call, that essentially passes it along. So if we go back to my picture, so app.call would move it from this middleware to this middleware. Then when this middleware calls app.call, it moves to the next one, and finally to the application. But also, if you so choose, you can just not call it and return from the middleware, which is often a handy thing to do. Say if you're authenticating a request and you know in the middleware where you're authenticating things that the user is not able to access the route that is asked for, you can return a 401 right then and there, and you don't have to invoke the rest of your application. So then on the other side of it, you're able to manipulate the response. So this super simple append to body middleware here just takes the body that is returned from the application and adds whatever value we've put here to the body. And then we return the same interface with the status, the headers, and the content. So here's a simple example. So this is added by that same middleware example I had here, where this was added by middleware. Is the configuration added here as the value, so it is appended. But I also added something to read any query params that are passed, and it adds them to the environment so the application is able to add them to the body. So the important thing here is a new bit to our configuration with this use method. So use is how you declare middleware. So with use, I say I want it to parse query params, and then I'm going to append to body, and I pass it the value I want it to append. And then here's my simple application. See, here's this environment now, clean params. This is not in the normal environment, the normal variables that Rack passes in. I add it with my parse query params middleware. So when it hits this, it runs a simple method to extract the query string into a simple hash, and it adds it to clean params. So my simple application here is able to simply access that and print that to the body that is returned. And then I still have the same example as before with append to body, where because we added this here, we're able to see that appended to the end of the body. So that is the simplest example of what middleware can do. So now we can get a little bit more sophisticated and go into some of the things that are pre-built out there in the world for us to use in our apps that are middleware that we can just pull in as gems and use. The simplest set is something called rack-contrib as part of the Rack project. It has a whole bunch of simple, easy to use middleware that are very useful for different situations. So Rack Backstage is one. It's when a file exists on the server, it will just serve that file and not the rest of the app. So if you wanted to put up an under construction page or something went wrong and you just want to disable access to the app, you just pop that file there, and all of a sudden that is all the server is showing, and the rest of the app won't show. Rack Profiler is an easy way of adding Ruby's profiling tools to a Rack app. You just use Rack Profiler, and they're there, and you have access to all the profile data that gets dumped out. If you hate your inbox, you can use Rack Mail Exceptions, which would work like Airbrake or one of the other air tracking tools you know, only it sends it straight to your inbox. Which is nice if you're cheap and hate your inbox. And Rack Nested Params does things like the same nested params you're used to in Rails. And Rack Access we've used several times to restrict access to parts of an app based on IP. So here's some config for using some of these common tools that you can use. So here's Backstage. So I simply require Backstage and tell it the destination or where the file is. So if there happens to be something in public that is backstage.html, that is what will be rendered and not my app. Same here for a TimeZone example. It provides some JavaScript for checking it. And so when I use Rack TimeZone adds a value to the environment, which can then be read by my app later on. So let's go to those examples. So here's the Backstage example. So here's my protected route. So it is not being blocked currently. This app is showing at this route. If I tell it to create the file and go back here, only the Backstage file will show. Super simple and easy to use. Every time I go back there until I delete that file, all I get is the Backstage file. And then the example for the time zone when I refresh is calculated the time zone for me, and I'll be able to access that information on the server. Now, there are also other gems that aren't part of Rack config that you can use. One handy one is Rack Protection, which is part of Sinatra. It adds a whole bunch of security and just default security stuff you should have around your web app. Rails includes a lot of it already or has its own version of it. But if you're not writing a Rails app, I would highly recommend including rack protection. There's rack cache, where if you want to do your own caching before your application even gets hit, you can use that. Rack proxy we have actually used several times, where we wanted to proxy to S3 or other services through the app. Rack CSRF for CSRF protection, and rack flash gives you Rails-like flash message handling in non-rack apps. You'll notice there's a pattern of people who don't want to use Rails implement gems to have the Rails features they want as middleware, because often in Rails those features are also just middleware. So here's some custom middleware that I wanted to show off that I wrote. It's some simple stuff just to illustrate some of the more power you can have when you write middleware yourself for Rack. So I have a custom logger and my spam fighter. So here is the config for this one. It is a Sinatra app. So I include nested params because I wanted some nicer params, and my logger. And then my spam fighter requires some arguments. It requires how many tries I want to allow them to hit a particular URL, a timeout, so how many times they can hit that within a certain time, and then a hash containing the different paths that I want to protect with my middleware. So I have get at 4 spammers. I only want them to be able to hit that at most 3 times in 60 seconds. But you could say if you're having a problem with somebody posting a whole lot to a particular URL, you can have this be post and then path to problem URL that you're having, and it would only let people post so many times to that URL. And then here's what Sinatra needs to set up sessions, and then the app. So here's my super simple web app. It is simply movie reviews. I was watching Lord of the Rings while I was writing this, so that's what ends up in here. So here's the log, just so it's simply viewable. I'll show how this was created. And then here's the fun one for spammers. So if spammers keep trying to hit this, they get an error thrown back at them with this custom page saying go away for a while, and in a minute they could come back and get this page again, but for the moment I've blocked them. So into how that works. So the spec I had for my custom logger is I wanted to be able to have multiple loggers, so not just one log file that gets written, but say I could do standard out and a log file. This would be handy for us because we use something called Rancher and Docker for deploying some of our apps. And if we're able to pipe to standard out, we can easily access the logs through a UI. But we also want a log somewhere else stored safely and not just Rancher handling the logs. So we split the duty. Also, there are some handy keys in the environment hash, which if you explicitly add values to those, it makes things easier, as I will explain. So here's some code for my custom logger. We're able to take a file log and a standard out log. And so the file log will log to the file, the standard out log will log to that. And then I had to create a custom multi-logger, which simply delegates whatever message is sent to the multi-logger to each of the loggers that I have given to this middleware. And that is it. But since I add it here at this particular key, when I use rack request, which I think both Sinatra and Rails subclass for their request objects, and now whenever I use request.logger, it will be my custom multi-logger. So anytime the app logs, it will log both the standard out and to my file. So if I come back here to where my app is running, You see I have logs here to standard out, but also in the app, when I pull up the file has them as well. So now the slightly more sophisticated spam fighter, where I wanted to throttle spam requests to a particular path, and I wanted to make it configurable, and I wanted to set the custom error page. So spam fighter takes those configuration objects I showed in the config, where I know the max amount of times I want them to be able to hit it, in what amount of time, and the hash of routes. So all it does is a simple check to see if it is one of the checked routes, because I don't want to do extra work in middleware that I don't have to for routes that I'm not checking. So it's a simple method for determining if the current path matches what is in my watched routes. If it is, then it instantiates a rack checker who goes and sees if it is allowed. And then I check for if they are not allowed. Public I'm a teapot HTML is what will get shown. And the reason, one thing I learned while writing this middleware is originally I had more stuff happening in the middleware class itself. But one thing to know is that these instances are maintained across requests by the rack server. So anything that is in instance variables is going to be maintained across requests, is essentially cached. So it is better to punt off work to being done in the call method than in the initialize method. You should just store standard config in the initialize method. Otherwise, weird things will happen. So then the spam checker simply goes through and increments the record, which is just a simple record in Redis. And if it comes back and says it's greater than my max count, then I kick it back and this is false. And they get the error page, or if it's true, they just pass on through the rest of the app. So then we get the behavior I showed before, where if they try to spam me, I tell them that the server is now a teapot and that they can't access me. So that is the end. We have used Rack a lot in things that we have done. We have Flash clients that we've had to set special headers for. We've had to deal with SAML and special things to manipulate the requests so that we can get SAML to work properly with many, many, many providers, as well as proxying a variety of things. And so since I know this was right before lunch, I'm available for questions, but you know, lunch is next as well if you prefer.
I've got a question. I played around with what I think ought to be a common problem of just converting hash keys from underscore to camel case. If you've got a client that wants to send you a camel case and you want to not deal with camel case,
yes,
that seems like an ideal sort of a middleware problem.
Yes.
I've tried, there's a gem out there that didn't seem to work very well, and I ended up just putting something into wrap parameters that did what I needed. Is that something you've dealt with, or is that?
Is this a Rails app?
This is a Rails app.
So the thing you need to understand when you get into Rails is rack, middleware, and apps all the way down. So often what happens when you need to write middleware for Rails, you need to understand where in the stack you need to put your middleware for it to apply before things that Rails does takes that over. So if Rails is taking your params before you are converting them and turning that into the params hash that you use in your controller, before your middleware has run to change the body of the request you have received to have the snake case keys, then you're going to get what Rails has put in params and not what you do later to those. So the order of the middleware is very important to make sure that happens. So if you did that before Rails tries to manipulate the params, you should have the keys the way you want. So if I understand the question, it's can you manipulate the request before it gets to the app and after?
Right.
Yes, you can manipulate in both directions. It just depends on where you call the method call on the app. If you manipulate the environment before you call app.call, then you are passing things along before. If you take the results of app.call and manipulate it and then return a new response, then that is what will get passed along. So you can manipulate everything on the way in and out.
That manipulation on the way out, is it done in the same layer order? I just remember the slide you had where it was middleware, 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 app. So on the way out, is that order preserved in reverse?
Yes. So just like my picture, way the heck back here. So the order is preserved. So the order in which you call use middleware, it will go down through that first and then back up the opposite direction, the reverse direction of how it handled the middleware coming in.
You mentioned order as something that matters. How aware do these middlewares have to be of each other?
That is unfortunately up to us and how we write our middleware. Like, I put my custom logger as the first middleware that's run so that every middleware after it has access and will use the logger I want it to use. If I put it as, say, the last one, any of my middleware that called request.logger to log something would use the standard logger that Rack inserts automatically, and only the app then would use my custom logger. Any other questions?